Hi, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church Stony Stratford, and we're continuing our series of short talks in the book of Luke. And we're looking at Luke chapter 1, verses 57 to 66 today. Now, after Luke's intensive focus on Mary, the action returns to Zechariah and Elizabeth. And we get to the point, haven't we, where Elizabeth has had her baby. She gives birth to a son, just as the angel said. And it says, verse 58, her neighbours and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. We tend to see the birth of children as somewhat routine today, but it was far riskier at that time. And obviously they were giving thanks for that. But I think Elizabeth would have been giving thanks for something else. We know that she and Zechariah were a godly couple, but they were old and they had no children. In those days, people would have thought, well, have they done something that's displeased God? Well, now there's the proof that they are godly people because they have visible proof. It actually says, doesn't it, when she became pregnant, she talks about her disgrace being taken away and the favour God had shown to them. Well, a birth of a child should always be a joyful thing, and it certainly was for them. And it comes to naming. It's the 8th day since the birth. It's the time when circumcision was carried out. And Elizabeth insists that he is to be called John, but no one really gets this, because they will say to her, well, look, you've got no relatives, with the name John. That would have been the common thing in those days, to name someone after someone closely related in the family. But she insists, and they then, as it says, they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. It seems when he was struck dumb, he may also have been struck with deafness as well. Well, to everyone's surprise, it says he asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, his name is John. Well, if that surprised them, because there was no one in the family who was called John, what happened next surprised them even more, because what happens? Well, immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak, praising God, verse 64. But there's something to note here. You see, Zechariah actually gives a sort of testimony here. He writes, his name is John. It's been foretold. And then this happens. And people are absolutely astonished by it. It says, verse 65, the neighbours were all filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, what then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hand was with him. Quite a surprise, eh? Be interesting to see what Zechariah first says, and we'll be looking at that next week. But what's in a name? Why was John and the name John so important? Well, John means the mercy or the grace of God. Now, one thing I think that's very interesting about this is that his parents had experienced that. There'd always been a cloud hanging over them because they had no children. And as I said, in those days, people would have taken that as a sign of God's displeasure. But God had certainly shown mercy and certainly shown grace. And we have Elizabeth's words acknowledging that. But there's something else here, isn't there? Something quite remarkable. And it is that John is being prepared for work. It's interesting, isn't it, that the actual comment Luke puts on this is that for the Lord's hand was on him. And we see something quite interesting about John. Yes, he's foretold. We see when we first encounter him later in Luke chapter 3. In verses 4 it says, as it was written in the words of Isaiah the prophet, a voice calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Every valley shall be filled in, every mountain shall be made low, the crooked roads shall become straight, the rough way smooth, and all mankind will see God's salvation. There you have it again, just as Zechariah wrote, his name is John, it had been foretold way back. The prophet Isaiah had spoken of John's coming to prepare the way for God's saving work. But how was this work going to take place? Well, we see from some words that John says, and they come from the Gospel of John the Apostle. Chapter 1 of John, verse 29. The next day John saw Jesus coming towards him and said, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Why does he use that phrase, Lamb of God? Well, because of the sacrifices of an unblemished and unspoiled lamb. And here, as he sees Jesus, he speaks about one who is sinless, but is going to become a sin bearer and take our sin upon himself. John was certainly going to be a very special person. And we see, don't we, just a hint there of the forthcoming of God's mercy and grace, which is so well summed up in his name. Thank you for listening.